people can sit on a therapist's couch for 6 years to do navel gazing and explore, and it never translates to anything in their lives. It never really changes the way they feel. It is not possible to develop the type of life experience that is good for you unless you know what that is. So that is what that exploration piece is like, how do we start to put language or awareness around what direction do I even want to go in? But then you have to couple it with experimentation.
Welcome to Project Loving Myself, the podcast where we dive deep into the messy, beautiful journey of self-discovery, self-love, and healing. Welcome back to Project Loving Myself, the podcast that brings you back to yourself through real self-love. We spend so much of our lives trying to figure out how to be happier, how to have better relationships, how to make better decisions, how to build a life that actually works for us. But underneath all of those questions is another one we don't ask nearly enough. How well do you actually know yourself? Because the way you think, the way you feel, the patterns you repeat, the relationships you choose, and even the goals you pursue don't exist separately from one another. They're all part of the same person, you. And sometimes creating a better life isn't about trying harder to feel happy or successful. It's about understanding yourself well enough to recognize what's actually happening and what needs to change. Joining me today is Dr. Lisa Marie Bobby, psychologist, licensed marriage and family therapist, board-certified coach, founder of Growing Self Counseling and Coaching, and host of the Love, Happiness, and Success podcast. We're talking about answering the questions so many of us wrestle with: why we feel the way we do, how our relationships affect our well-being, and what meaningful personal growth actually requires of us. Because maybe one of the most important parts of loving yourself is actually knowing who you're loving. Dr. Lisa, welcome to Project Loving Myself. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you, and same. We're going to have the best time and hopefully create a lot of value for our friends here sitting in on this conversation, because we're talking about important things.
Absolutely. So I want to jump right into kind of the really interesting stuff. Why do you think, Dr. Lisa, so many high-achieving women believe success will finally make them feel fulfilled? Like, that's the million-dollar question. We kind of hit a wall with that over and over again, but we still think it's true. Why do you think that?
Well, that's actually a very common psychological principle that's driving the motivation behind all kinds of different things. This false belief that when you attain a something, a goal, a whatever, then you will be happy. And this isn't just related to career, by the way. So certainly success could be one expression of this, but that's also often what's motivating a desire to lose a bunch of weight or change the way your body looks. It can be a desire to get married, have a baby, buy a house. When I have attained some imaginary ideal on the outside, then I will feel differently on the inside. So this is something that everybody is vulnerable to, not just high-achieving women.
But the thing is, right, Lisa, we kind of need to believe that goal is going to get us something because that's the motivation, right? So in absence of that idea that, okay, this is going to finally give me that one thing I want, we may not actually complete our goals. We may not reach there. We may not have the motivation to work for it. So how does one find that kind of happy medium where you're still motivated, but it's not the be all and end all of everything?
Well, I think, the first step is oftentimes recognizing it for what it is. And that takes a little bit of practice. And so there's a principle in positive psychology where this is widely recognized that everybody strives. I'm sure you've done a little bit of, when I have 1 million podcast subscribers, then I will, whatever it is, which I'm sure you will at some point. But the reality we don't often recognize is that we feel about the same no matter how our life circumstances change. So we've been able to see through psychological research is that there can be a brief effect. Like you buy a car, you go on the vacation, you get the diploma, whatever it is. You have this little boost, but then you kind of go back to your baseline experience of happiness. Researcher, very famous one, Martin Seligman, actually termed this the hedonic treadmill because it's so common, meaning that people keep chasing and chasing and chasing and chasing the thing. It's the next mountain. It's the one right behind it. Well, I made it to that one, but I still kind of feel the same. So like, what's ahead? And this is something that we're vulnerable to throughout our lives, no matter what. And so step one is, first of all, just recognizing like, oh, okay, yeah, that's what I'm doing. And also recognizing when we still kind of feel the same, no matter what our circumstances change.
So, Lisa, do you think also there might be this permission component in this idea as well, that we feel we need to reach a certain goal to give ourselves the permission to do something else or to feel confident or to feel good enough? So permission is almost what we're searching for on a deeper level rather than the goal.
Yeah, certainly. Like there's that hope that if I do something good enough, then I will have a reward, which will be happy. But honestly, I don't know that it's that conscious. I think that there's oftentimes a non-conscious association with the striving. And I think, many times if you look around in your life, people that you admire, that you see as being successful, or people that appear happy and like what's true about them, then if I have that, then I will also be happy. I think that there can also be a lot of vulnerability for people who tend to have a externally defined sense of self-worth. And maybe this is more what you're getting at, because when people really don't feel good about themselves on the inside and struggle to feel worthy or good enough, they kind of start pulling all kinds of things into that black hole. And if I put enough stuff in there, then it'll change the way I feel. And one of the most powerful things can be this reflected sense of self. So if somebody else looks at me and thinks I'm pretty or successful or wealthy or have my act together, whatever it is, then there can be this little jolt and people start living for that reflected sense of self because they can't generate it on their own. And so that can also be one of the drivers here.
Let me take a quick moment to tell you about something interesting I've made to thank you for being a listener on Project Loving Myself. If you've ever reached a goal and wondered, why doesn't this feel as fulfilling as I thought it would? Well, there may be something deeper worth exploring in that. I created the Success Blocks checklist to help you uncover the hidden patterns around self-worth, control, and success that may be keeping you from fully enjoying everything you've worked so hard to create. You'll find the link to this free downloadable checklist in the show notes. Now back to the conversation.
There's a saying, we often see ourselves through other people's eyes. And that's really what you're talking about when you're saying, this reflected sense of self. And Dr. Lisa, I've seen that a lot of women who perhaps are living this through this reflected sense of self, they have what other people may see as successful. For example, they have a great career, financial stability, they have the family, they have everything that looks good on paper or in the pictures. And yet, deep down inside, they feel lonely, they feel unfulfilled. In your experience, what is happening beneath the surface for many of these women?
Well, to your point, that old saying, no matter where you go, there you are.
Oh, I love that.
That is not my quote. I can't even remember who said it, but
Yes.
it's true. You bring yourself with you. And so what we know is that people tend to have a baseline of happiness, a baseline of satisfaction and contentment. And maybe think about that in your own life. I know for me, it was when I graduated from college, when I did this, when I did that, and this expectation. And you really feel about the same as you always did. And so I think that this loneliness and dissatisfaction isn't necessarily as a result of all the striving, although it certainly can be. People who are doing stuff just to do stuff and chasing a golden ring because they think it will get them something that it never does, over time, that can lead to the sense of disconnection with the self if it is resulted in somebody living in a way that is substantially out of alignment with either their core wiring or their values. And we could talk more about that. But I think more commonly, it's about the same way they have always felt when you start to unpack it and really hear the stories of their lives, that it isn't because of the career. It's just, there they are again.
Yeah, it does. And I like what you said about their core wiring and their values. So let's talk a little bit more about that, because I think what most women experience is that physical loneliness or a sense of just disconnection or numbness. And I think that goes back to what you're talking about. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, and I think the thing that is also important to understand is that different people have different wiring and different personalities and different motivations. And so what has honestly been very useful to me and other professionals, and stay with me, I'm going to say something, something that, if another clinician listening to this is like, wait, what? The Enneagram theory of personality. So there are 9 personality types, and there's a pop culture component to this where people are like Enneagram, Schmenneagram, right? But there's also a fair amount of research coming from like Dan Siegel, who is a very well-respected psychologist, a medical doctor, actually, and researcher in the field, that is looking at these subtypes of personality that can also be understood as a constellation of like big 5 personality traits. That the punchline here is that everybody shows up in typically one of about 9 different flavors. And there can be some variance based on life experience, based on other contributing factors, but this is pretty stable over time. And so like what you just said, somebody who's really feeling lonely, craving connection, that actually might be part of their core wiring. That is not actually universally true for everyone or all women, but they really want and need that sense of connection through something that's meaningful to them, that's frequently in alignment with their value system. And so it's not just a relationship, but a relationship that's fulfilling that need. Somebody with a different type of wiring might have an entirely different need or experience of exactly the same set of circumstances. So I think it's also really important, and one takeaway from your listeners perhaps, is not to judge yourself by a singular yardstick, like, something that's true for everyone, but instead really get thoughtful about who am I and how do I feel, and like, how do I develop more respect and appreciation for that, even if it's different than that of other people or what I think I should feel, because that's not usually true.
I'm taking this to mean, as I just kind of unpack what you said, that for some people, it is their inherent nature to need more connection, more sense of belonging than for other people. So they may feel the lack of that more than another person. So if we are to start understanding ourselves through these different kind of core personalities, right? You talked about 9 Enneagram.
But that desire for connection or desire for independence, there's another index there, which is related to our attachment drives, which can happen in addition to personality variables. So there's like these different indexes that kind of like stick together, and we're all a various combination of a few different things and then values layered on top of that. But yes, you're right.
So when people, let's say you work with, start to become more aware of these different dimensions or aspects of themselves, what changes? How does that actually help them either come out of whatever they feel stuck in or challenged by, or does it just change their perspective? What have you seen?
Going back to, your original framing for this conversation is, how do you get reconnected with yourself? How do you create a fulfilling life? And really, this is step 1. Who am I? What do I care about? What do I like? What feels good to me? What feels bad to me? As is a constellation of my unique, not just personality, but relational style, my preferences, my values, like it all counts. But just being able to have that be a conscious and also important to you, because I think that where it starts to become problematic is when whatever that is like less important than anything else you're doing in your life, be it, chasing a career, being a mother, all kinds of things can disconnect someone from themselves.
And it's interesting because we do this in other areas. So I was in a business mastermind program a couple of years ago, and one of the first things we did when I got into the program is we did this wealth dynamics assessment, and we did this Colby analysis. And essentially, we were trying to understand how we operate as entrepreneurs. We were trying to understand what we look for in good working dynamics, or perhaps what we're driven by. And I remember doing those tests and just understanding so much more about myself and almost validating parts of myself that I just thought was uniquely me. And it is still uniquely me, but now I understand it through the framing of these different tools. And I think that allowed me to feel more comfortable with myself as a business owner, as an entrepreneur. And it also informed me, so I made better choices. I made better decisions. So I do hear you, and I do feel that maybe maybe this is something we sometimes miss in this search for personal development or self-improvement. We sometimes are always looking for the problems to fix. And what you're saying is sometimes just understanding who we are, what our values are, what our inner wiring is can really, make a huge difference.
Yes, absolutely. And this appreciation for the self and your own uniqueness, but it also helps you have much healthier relationships with other people when you're able to see their differences. And so a mistake that people often make is assuming that other people are more like them than they actually are. And this can lead to a whole host of other problems, particularly in relationships, where you begin judging your partner or conflict starts happening because you expect or want somebody to be more like you or more like some, version, rather than using the same things that we're talking about right now to understand who this person really is, what is their wiring, what do they care about, and have it be okay if that is different, not just okay, but actually appreciating, even celebrating those differences. They feel valued and cared about as well, and all of a sudden there becomes space for you both to be more of what you actually are.
So, Lisa, it sounds though that you would need a lot of knowledge to be able to put some of this in practice. But I know that things aren't as difficult as they sometimes seem.
They're not.
So right? And so give me maybe some easy steps for a listener who has never thought of it in this way. Right?
Yeah.
How do they just start applying some of these things that we're talking about or start learning about it without it feeling overwhelming or intimidating?
Yeah. Even just to set a simple intention, who am I, right? Now, you can certainly mess around with some assessments like we were talking about. And, some of them are more helpful than others. But, and even if in the show notes, I'll follow up with you and give you 2 or 3 that I really like and use commonly with clients to get under the hood a little bit about, personality. Certainly, core strengths can be very valuable. I think values assessment can never go wrong with that. But just to begin to get a picture of not just who am I, but also considering that, other people score differently on this. And so beginning to just research and learn, who am I in relation to others and just developing that sense of self in that way. The other thing, though, is simply tapping into your preferences. What do you like? What flavor ice cream do you like? Do you like the car windows up or down? What sort of music do you like? And just beginning to honor that self and just basic preferences. And these are small things, but this all strengthens the muscle. These are all parts of the constellation of, not just who am I and what do I enjoy, but that it is okay for me to have what I want and do more of what I want because I want to.
You know what I love about what we're talking about is, so I work with the deeper emotional work, right? But I also understand there is space. There is a place for just understanding yourself, asking questions about what you want and making choices based on your own understanding of yourself. And I think that is something that maybe a lot of people forget to do. And there are some people who aren't ready for that deeper emotional work. And this is a great place to start. This is dip your feet, get your feet wet, dip your feet in, and just start understanding yourself, understanding who you are and what is important to you. And I think both of these, I would say, explorations get us to a place where we feel more complete, more whole, more in control of our life. What are some of these other benefits that you have seen with perhaps clients you've worked with or people you coach or counsel? What should people expect if they start doing this kind of work? And of course, your expertise is, and in context of this conversation, is some of these self-inquiry or some of these different tools that we can use.
Yeah, absolutely. And so first and foremost, I think that going into hard places is certainly very important, particularly when there is a trauma history. The way that we treat trauma and metabolize that is by things like exposure therapy, re-experiencing, and there are a variety variety of very effective clinical mental health interventions. And so if somebody is dealing with this, that please look for a qualified licensed provider who can use evidence-based modalities to help you process this, because it actually lives in your brain in a different way. But it is also true that even in psychotherapy, the types of treatment that have been shown to most reliably create outcomes, even for things like major depressive disorder, where a lot of dark feelings are often present, is actually to train people to not be so fixated on the negativity. There's actually unhelpful thinking patterns that are commonly associated with depression and anxiety. And so, ruminating on that over and over and over again tends to make that stronger. And so part of what we do is to teach people how to actually take some steps back out of that and then shift. And part of the active ingredient in the most effective forms of psychotherapy is not just, talking about negative feelings, but actively creating positive new experiences. And that is true for cognitive behavioral therapy. So, we manage the cognitions and try to help people out of the darkness cognitively. But then what are you actively building into your life that supports your experience of health, energy, relationship, vibrancy, wellness, meaning, joy, flow? We move back into the light when we're doing this intentionally. And so what people can experience this is that ideally we all have access to our dark emotions. The goal is never to make dark emotions go away. It is part of the human experience, and the ideal is when we can understand these as valuable and as very positive. My feelings are telling me something that I need to listen to. What is that? And we have a healthy relationship with that. We can stay in them long enough to take that. And what is also true is that when we are intentionally creating meaningful, joyful, fun lives worth living, according to our definition, by the way, that is how people really have, what Michael Hyatt calls the double win. You can have an amazing career and be successful and also be a happy human with great relationships and a nice life. You can have
You can have it all.
Yeah, you can have it all.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tell me this idea of the positive, focusing on the positive and creating that some people call this self-love play. So it's you focus on creating a life that feels good from the inside as much as it looks from the outside. Is this kind of what you're talking about, Dr. Lisa? Can you give us something a little more in terms of examples of what that would look like or how this would be done?
I think it's a great term. I would say exactly, really what we've been talking about, those examples, is considering who you are, how you feel, what you want, what it feels like you need, making space for dark emotions, but also working intentionally to create life experiences that feel genuinely good for you, unapologetically. The one thing that I would change is that, do we really need to make sure that it looks good on the outside? If that is something that is genuinely important to you as a human, that you get a zing when you get a compliment about looking fantastic, fine, go ahead and do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think my hope for people is to be self-directed and self-connected enough that it is because I want to. And that's also a very important psychological principle. One of the founding fathers of modern day psychotherapy, Carl Rogers, his whole theory of humanistic psychology is how do we create congruence? How do we get into alignment with who we are and the way that we are living? And there's no right answer to that question, but it is like closing the gap between who I am and what I do and what my life looks like. And when that gap is wide, when there's a big difference between who I really am and what I really want, between what I actually do day to day, that is when people experience suffering because they're fundamentally dissatisfied. They're not having a good time.
I want to pull this thread because this is something I've seen a lot with people that I've coached or worked with, that they do confuse what they do with who they are, right? And that becomes where a lot, like you said, the suffering comes in because there's a disconnect, there's a gap, and there's a sense of a lack of worthiness that comes in, or judgment, or a lot of different layers start to come in that make a person not feel happy or fulfilled in their life. So what does one do when they are in that gap? What do they need to shift, or what action do they need to take?
So I think that is going to be a little bit different for everyone depending on the wiring. So like even as you and I are talking right now, what I hear coming out of my mouth is evidence of my own wiring and my own value system. So like what is important to me and what I seek to create in my own life, I like having a good time. I want things to be fun, right? Like enjoyment is important to me. And so this might blow some people's minds, but it is honestly the truth. Like people look at my resume or CV and they're like, oh, you're so successful. You've done so many things in the doctorate and the business, whatever. It is all because I want to and it's fun for me. Do you know what I mean? Like if all of that went away, it would take me about 3 hours to be like, you know what we could do and get all excited about a different thing and then start going in that direction. Like because that is what motivates me.
That's what I saw from you right away. When you and I connected, right?
Yeah.
I was like, you're not just a serious, like person who is a little bit black and white. I feel like you're very fun and spontaneous, and there's this kind of like excitement in you that cannot be contained. So people can feel who you are
a little bit, but yeah, exactly.
In a good way, in a wonderful way,
right? That gap for me, and I have experienced this in my own life, by the way, is when I don't like this, and I think we all get into that, especially as business owners. Like there's stuff that has to be done and there's nobody else to do it, so I'm going to do it. Like kind of getting into that grind, or I think physical depletion can start to get me down. And so those are my answers. However, depending on the way that you're wired, the answer to filling that gap, it might be a deep, emotionally intimate connection with a lot of sharing and time together, right? For somebody else who has a very strong creative drive, they cannot feel like themselves unless they are making something, making art, making music, designing something, right? Like that is the coin of their realm. Other people get very jazzed by mastery. There is so energizing to learn new things. This can look like so many different things, and there isn't one right answer, but the answer will come when we do the self-exploration and think about who am I? What do I want? What feels meaningful and important to me on a number of different indices. And we haven't even talked about values yet, but then my job in this carnation is to figure out how to amplify that in ways that are good for me and also good for hopefully others, right? We don't want to be so self-absorbed we blow out of our relationships. Unless you want to do that, whatever, do that too. But thinking about, is this in alignment with my value system?
The word I picked out from what you said is that self-exploration, as that being key to living a life that feels more fulfilling, more aligned, more like you instead of more like everybody else. And because we are just all unique and we have our own kind of wiring, we talked about the wiring and you said the values. And that's what I'd love to kind of unpack next, is how the values come into the picture. But what I'm understanding is that it is about this self-exploration that should guide us forward. And somehow if we follow that path, we are going to live.
2 pieces. Step 1 is self-exploration. It is not possible to develop a type of life experience that is good for you unless you know what that is. So that is what that exploration piece is like, how do we start to put language or awareness around what direction do I even want to go in? But then you have to couple it with experimentation. Exploration is, people can sit on a therapist's couch for 6 years to do navel gazing and explore, and it never translates to anything in their lives. It never really changes the way they feel, right? So then it turns into this experimentation and then this application of, so this is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to do more of this and I'm going to do less of that.
And then what would be the next step from there?
Certainly. Rinse and repeat. If you start doing that in different domains of life, then over time you come into alignment in all ways. And that's how you really begin to have that experience that you were describing at the beginning of our time together. It's like if the goal is to feel connected with yourself and genuinely happy and content and like I am where I am, right? So that coming back into alignment, like that's what this looks like. And also to remember that there are many different domains of life. So, we're not just a one-dimensional thing, and people have different clusters of this. There could be a career, an intimate partnership, parenting, right? Spirituality, health, finance, finance, right? Friendships and social circles, the relationship with your family of origin, where you live, what your house looks like. I mean, these are all different domains that are going to be differently important for different people. But then we can begin this like inquiry and experimentation and activation everywhere we are.
Right. And the possibilities for that are actually, there's just so many, right? There's so many ways to understand ourselves and experience ourselves. Beautiful. And then how does values come in?
So then values are almost a different index, if you will. So, there's core personality, there's relational styles, but then values are different. And those can be related to the way you are wired and the things that come naturally to you or that you're sort of primed to want in your life because of just your biology or physiology. But I think values are oftentimes a product of a few different things. It can be your life experiences, but it is also can be thought of as like, what is most important to you, which is a different thing than who you fundamentally are, although values are still pretty stable. And so it's not just understanding values, but it's also then understanding the priority in which they are ranked, so to speak. So for an example, a priority could be family, it could be financial security, it could be spirituality, right? It could be novelty. And also, there are not an infinite assortment of values. People oftentimes conflate the things that they like or the things that they do with values, and that's not actually true. A colleague of mine, Susie Welch, I'm such a huge fan of her work. She did a beautiful assessment called the Values Bridge. And I think that in her system kind of isolated it down to, I want to say 12 different values constructs. And so this assessment can bring those into light, but then also give you a snapshot of how they are ordered, because that makes a difference in what you do. So say your values might be your family, your financial stability, and then for some people, there's an orientation towards beauty, order, design, right? If family is first, though, before wealth and beauty, you're going to prioritize that. So your house is going to be a disaster and you're going to be spending a lot of money on your kids and maybe working less because that's the one that comes first. For other people, though, the wealth thing might be more important. So they're going to spend more time away and less time with their kids because they are actually in alignment with that core value. And there's not a right or wrong. The mistake comes when we judge ourselves or other people for their values. And particularly in our intimate partnerships, this can create a lot of conflict until we can lift these differences up into the light and understand how we can have complementary strengths.
So your values essentially guide your choices. And the pitfall becomes when you think your values are the only values that matter, or your values are, what somebody else's values should look like too. So while you were talking, Dr. Lisa, this quote, I would call it might be, I don't know who said it as well, but it says, to love yourself is to know yourself. And I feel like that is the summary of what we're talking about, that I talk a lot about self-love as being very important for every individual, for them to kind of find joy and truth and alignment in their life, that self-love is kind of how you navigate your life in a better way. So loving yourself is also about knowing yourself better, understanding yourself better. And when you can understand yourself better, I feel like you can then look at other people with that same lens of understanding and valuing who they are and how they work in their own life, which I think this is something you've said in many ways allows you to communicate better, allows you to relate better, not only to yourself, but to other people. And I think this is such a simple yet powerful thing to come back to, that it is important to explore yourself and to understand yourself better, whether it's through the filter of values, whether it's through understanding your inner wiring or the Enneagram. That is something that I'm getting from our conversation today, that there's so many ways in which we can understand ourselves better and show up better. more truly as ourselves in our lives. And so I want to invite you to give me your perspective from this conversation and also to kind of share your Project Loving Myself mantra with our audience today.
As an inheritance from my mother, who is a deeply, deeply spiritual person. She made her transition into angelness about 5 years ago, but she was an angel even before that. And, growing up, she introduced me to many spiritual systems, but she really appreciated the work of Louise Hay, the founder of Hay House Publishing, who has become a hero of mine. And so, whenever I start to feel down or like I need a reset, I always go back to Louise Hay. So the infinity of life where I exist, everything is perfect, whole, and complete. I am one with the divine force that created me. And just come back. Divine energy, here we are, all is well. And that works for me every time. How about you? I must know yours.
I always say that the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with yourself, which is, I know, something that is very important for you too. And so my mantra is always kind of, what do I want? What do I need? Asking myself those questions to always bring myself back to me, because it's so easy to get lost and caught up in, what's going on around us. And we lose sight of ourselves, of who we are and what we really want. And that is something that I believe, reminding yourself to connect back to yourself, loving yourself every single day, just paying attention to yourself is something that I think is a very powerful way to live your life. So Project Loving Myself is exactly about that.
Amazing. I love it. My needs matter too.
Yes.
So good.
Absolutely. Lisa, how do people learn more about the work you do? How do they follow you? Please share with our audience.
Thank you so much. Well, certainly the easiest way, Love, Happiness, and Success podcast, available wherever you hear podcasts. We put out 2 shows a week, and sometimes it's me teaching on different topics, but also what I try to do is bring out really thought leaders and people who are shaping our understanding of this entire space. In my feed, you can scroll back, find interviews with Dick Schwartz, founder of Internal Family Systems Theory. Another fantastic one was Dr. Bill Doherty, who is an expert on fractured relationships and is now doing work to heal political divides in our society. Certainly talk on, trauma treatment, psychedelic therapies with Dr. Scott Shannon. So there's a lot of really good information. If you happen to be a therapist, I have a companion podcast called Love, Happiness, and Success for Therapists, where we're going behind the scenes to talk about, the art and craft and science on that show. And then certainly, growingself.com is the website of my practice. All of the clinicians in my practice are licensed therapists, typically marriage and family therapists, who also are board certified coaches. So we are not doing necessarily clinical mental health, although we can. However, if you require treatment, I would encourage you, if you can, to, even go through your insurance. Medically necessary treatment is healthcare as far as I'm concerned. However, if you are looking for personal development, improved outcomes in yourself, your relationship, and your career, we can help facilitate the transformation of Growing Self. And the place to start, growingself.com, and just request a free consultation. We'll take it from there.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Lisa. This was a very interesting conversation because we touched on things that I actually don't normally talk about.
Oh, really?
So I think what
was different?
I think a lot of what you talked about was a therapist and clinical point of view. I don't tend to bring in so much of that into some of my episodes, but it was really, really interesting to hear some of the different clinical terms and studies and so on. So terminology. So I think, that was great.
Oh, well, I genuinely hope that it was helpful to your listeners and your community.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, this was a real pleasure.
What I'm taking away from this conversation with Dr. Lisa is that understanding yourself is the first step, because you can't build relationships or happiness or success that actually fits you when you've never taken the time to know who you're building them for. That's why I keep coming back to something so simple. To love yourself is to know yourself. Not the version of you that you think you should be, not the version other people expect. The real you, your patterns, your needs, your strengths, your vulnerabilities. And maybe that's where real growth begins. Not with judging yourself for what isn't working, but being willing to look at it, to get curious about why it's there. Because the more clearly you see yourself, the more intentionally you can choose what happens next. If this episode gave you a new way of understanding yourself, send it to someone who needs this conversation too. Follow Project Loving Myself. New episodes drop every week, and come find me at Sanaya Gurnimal on all channels. Until next time, you are loved.